Hello, everybody. Welcome to our new series of webinars on gender-sensitive social protection that FAO's social protection and gender teams are organizing jointly with our colleagues from the IPC Center in Brasilia. My name is Maja Gavrilovic. I'm a social protection specialist working for FAO. And in today's webinar, we will discuss how gender results can be effectively assessed and measured in social protection programs. We will reflect on the key issues and lessons from mainly impact evaluation, but also some other types of evaluation research to explore several questions. For example, we will discuss today to what extent is gender considered in the evaluations of social protection, what types of gender outcomes and impacts are being measured, and what is really missing from our analytical frameworks. What role can different research methods play in collecting data on gender impacts? And also we will discuss what practical challenges evaluators face in doing this kind of work, and how is evidence used to influence the programming. Now, we have three great panelists today, and I have to apologize to our male participants of the webinar that we have a quite gender imbalanced team, but I think it's going to be very interesting. So our first panelist is Elena Bardassi, and she's the senior economist at the World Bank. She specializes in labor issues, poverty, and gender, and she has been working as a thematic coordinator of the World Bank's independent evaluation group. And she's been focusing on gender, and she has been very instrumental in facilitating the integration of gender in project and thematic evaluations of the bank. So in 2014, she was the lead author of the Social Safety Nets and Gender Report, which involved a systematic gender review of the impact evaluations conducted by the bank. And she will today talk of her experience of conducting this important study, and she will also share some of the main findings of the review. And then we will hear from Susana Martinez-Restrepo. She is a co-founder and director of research and development of the organization, feminist organization called Core Women. And Susana has done a considerable research in South America to assess the impacts of social protection on women's economic empowerment. And today she will reflect on some of the conceptual and methodological issues and challenges that she has grappled as a researcher when trying to measure this very elusive and quite complex topic of women's empowerment. And she has recently published a book called Measuring Women's Economic Empowerment, Critical Lessons from South America, and she will share the link to her book that you can download for free later on. And then our final panelist is Dr. Tara Cookson, and Tara is a co-founder and director of Ladysmith. This is a feminist venture that helps international development organizations to collect, analyze, and take action on gender data. And we have invited Tara to talk to us about her very interesting study in Peru, where she used ethnographic methods to investigate the impacts of the junta's conditional cash transfer program on women who were the principal recipients of the benefits. And she will reflect on the role and relevance of using more sort of unorthodox data collection methods, such as the ethnographic research, to assess gender outcomes, and she will tell us how this evidence was used to influence program redesign. So in terms of the webinar format, we will first hear from panelists, and each of them will have around 15 minutes to present the presentation, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. And I encourage you to ask your questions, and you can either write them directly into the GoToWebinar chat bar on the screen, or you can write to us through social media, your Twitter and Facebook accounts using #sp.org webinar. So let me now open the floor for Elena to start her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, colleagues, for organizing this webinar, and thank you all that are connected to this session. So my name is Elena Bardassi. I'm in the independent evaluation group of the World Bank. I'm not a social protection specialist, so I'm talking more as an evaluator and gender specialist today. And I presented this report that together with Gisela Garcia and other colleagues in IAG, we put together in 2014. So the original intent was really to put together a systematic review of impact evaluations on social safety nets. I'm talking about social safety nets, not social protection in general. And we did that, but we thought that it would have been very interesting also to look at projects funded by the World Bank and looking at what extent they integrate gender. Next slide, please. So the outline of my presentation today, I will briefly present what is in the report. You can find it online. You will find the link at the end. I will reflect on some methodological issues that are particularly important when doing this work, the ones that we encountered during the production of the report. I will focus on some findings, and because I understand that you had a series of webinars, and today is the focus is more on results and outcomes and methodology, I will focus mostly on the methodological aspects. And I will conclude by presenting some reflection on the institutional challenges that we face in a social safety net project, but also more broadly in other types of projects in integrating gender in design and evaluation. Next slide, please. So the aim of the social safety net and gender report was to look at what extent the intervention impact, the social safety net interventions impact gender equality and achieve results for both women and men, girls and boys. We wanted to look at issues related to design, whether these achievement of gender equality is an objective, is an explicit objective or of these interventions or not, and which dimensions are going to be involved, what are the assumptions, what are the outcome indicators. We obviously wanted to look at results and whether these interventions have different impacts for men and women, if they have impacts that are different for different types of women, for example, poor women or women of a certain ethnic minority, if these are positive, these are negative. An interesting aspect that we actually were not able to explore as much as we wanted, whether there are trade-offs between the objective of reducing poverty, which is usually the main goal of social safety net interventions, and the objective of achieving gender equality. And then we wanted also, hopefully, to find something on cost and benefits, which is, however, very, very, very limited in projects, to understand whether it's convenient, really, to address gender equality in projects. If this can be presented as an incentive for a task team leader to think about it. Next slide, please. So what we did, we looked at that time in 2014, 145 impact evaluations in 128 individual studies. We also looked at 112 World Bank supported investment projects. So the impact evaluations are irrespective of who funded the intervention, while for the desk review of projects, we only focused on World Bank projects that were approved between 2003 and 2013. And we looked at social safety net, including conditional and unconditional cash transfer, non-contributory pensions, in-kind food transfer, and the public works programs. We didn't include the vouchers or subsidies or school meals, so interventions that were smaller in scale. Next slide, please. So let's now look at some of the methodological issues that we encountered. The main goal, in all of this intervention, we found that the main explicit goal of social safety net is to reduce poverty, current poverty or future poverty, through improving the human capital of children, It's not necessarily achieving gender equality, but we found that it's almost impossible not to think of a way in which social safety net intervention don't impact gender. So as an evaluator, this was really a fundamental, one of the most fundamental issues. It's very hard to claim that social safety net intervention, and this is true for a lot of other interventions, don't have gender differentiated impacts, don't have impacts at the level of the household, within the household. Even if these impacts are very hard to measure, they are there. And not recognizing this impact can have negative consequences, because there is not an explicit recognition of the potential that the project can have to support gender equality, and sometimes also the possibility of the project of creating negative consequences for women that have to be anticipated and addressed. So in general, what we found that there is a range of options that might be recognized at the design level, at the design stage, that are sometimes recognized. We find that especially in public works, there is more and more an attention of including quotas to increase the participation of women. There are, especially in conditional cash transfer, an approach, like a functional targeting. Essentially, the recognition is that because women behave in a different way, then there is an instrumental targeting in order to improve outcomes for children. And we also find that in some cases, interventions that are apparently neutral, such as non-contributory pensions, might disproportionately benefit women. In general, though, there is nothing that is gender neutral, and there are, however, different levels of recognition when setting up the intervention and when analyzing the results of the intervention. Next slide. So, for example, when analyzing the impact evaluation, we found that 58% of the studies that we ended up looking at are essentially focusing on gender outcomes. Is this high? Is this low? Let's say, there are many different impact evaluations for a specific program, and several of these impact evaluations look, of course, at outcomes such as poverty, for example, and that's their main goal. So, of course, we thought that the fact of finding 58% of impact evaluation that really look at gender differentiated outcomes is a very good result. However, when we look at projects, next slide, please. We found that the neglect of considering gender elements in design could be more problematic. We found that only 45% of the project have some gender element in their design, and 39% have gender in the results framework. It's possible that these statistics are improving. We found that because these are the individual interventions that the World Bank does, these are very low percentages. Next slide. In order to analyze both the impact evaluations and the project, a fundamental step was to organize, to identify the outcomes, was to set up an analytical framework. So we used the literature on empowerment, on bargaining power, to really come up with a framework that could lead us to select the outcomes that are of interest in this evaluation. And this also helped for us to organize this huge amount of evidence that we were dealing with in a coherent way. Next step, next slide. Next slide, please. As I said, looking at the framework, analyzing the framework help us to organize the outcomes in buckets, let's say, and we use the World Development Report 2012 on gender equality in order to identify categories of outcomes. Some of these were just at the household level on the right-hand side, so household income, household consumption and expenditure, and the others, the one we were mostly interested in, were the gender disaggregated and female-specific outcomes that we organized under endowment, economic opportunities, and voice and agency. Next slide. I don't have time today to go through all the evidence that we are discussing in the report under each of these outcome headings, but let me go through some of the findings, focusing mostly on the methodological aspect and some of the key issues that we encountered. First of all, we found that there is a rich and increasing evidence from impact evaluation on gender impacts. We found that unlike other intervention in other fields, social safety nets are very open to explore outcomes that are unintended or not explicitly integrated in the project objectives. Next slide, please. So the second finding was that we, however, found an uneven distribution of impact evaluation across intervention and outcomes. So when we look at outcomes, for example, still the most explicit outcomes prevail, like education, health, and employment. But you see that there is also a non-negligible amount of evidence on outcomes such as fertility and decision-making and domestic violence, which are outcomes that are not really part of the project objectives very often. However, a lot of this evidence is generated by the analysis of conditional cash transfers. We found that public works, for example, that are a very common intervention in the bank, are not impact evaluated in a way that is able to tell us what are the gender impacts, the individual impacts for men and women from the intervention. There are not as many impact evaluation, but there are also not as many impact evaluation that present gender disaggregated outcomes. They tend to look at averages across the population. Next slide, please. We also found that there is a discrepancy between where the social safety net programs are and where the evidence comes from. This is the most striking, or it was in 2014, the most striking map that we were able to produce. So in pink, you see where the public works are, where there are public works programs, and the little dots is where we were able to find evidence of gender disaggregated impacts of these programs. As you see, there is a disconnect there. Next slide, please. The other problem we have is that a lot of the impact evaluation is, is looking at the short-term impacts. 2 years, 1 to 2 years is the most common length of the time horizon that this impact evaluation analyze. And for a lot of gender impacts, think, for example, empowerment, this is a very short time period. So it's very unclear whether we are really capturing an effect that is meaningful. Next slide. We also found a very dishomogeneity in how important concepts such as empowerment are measured. In some cases, this is measured just only as spending ability, the ability of the woman of deciding how to spend the money. In other cases, they were multiple dimensions that were analyzed and looked at. In other cases, the employment was considered to be a measure of empowerment, which is debatable. And the other panelists, I'm sure they are going to tell us more about that. We found that gender was not integrated as much in World Bank projects, and the set of indicators that are looked at is very narrow, is usually focusing on compliance, on take-up, not really on ultimate outcomes. And that even when it would be possible to disaggregate the indicators by gender, by sex, this is hardly found, or not as done as it could be. Next slide. Let me conclude by mentioning a few points that are about the institutional about the institutional environment of taking gender on board in a project. This is a something that is particularly, this is true in every project, not particularly for social safety net, but definitely also for social safety net intervention. So the World Bank has adopted a new strategy in 2015, and quite interestingly, the approach here is not to stress too much of this general mainstreaming across the board, but really the importance of focusing on which gaps each project could address, through specific actions, and which type of indicators can be used to measure how these gaps might evolve in time during the life of the project. In the World Bank, we have gender labs that are supporting teams in integrating impact evaluations in their project in order to measure these gender differentiated impacts. We have focal points that help, we have tools. However, one important lesson from the report is that impact evaluations are important, but are fundamental, but are not sufficient. Also, good M&Es are very important, and these have to be built on a clear understanding of a theory of change, a clear integration of all the potential impacts that can happen in project, including those that might not be immediately intended. And in doing so, it's possible to prevent negative impacts, but also to use all the potential of the project to address also some of the gaps that are identified at the diagnostic stage. So I hope that this gives you a little bit of a flavor of the report. Next slide. You can find it online. That's the link, and you can also reach out to me and Gisela if you have specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, for a very good presentation, and we will move straight to Susanna. Susanna, are you ready?
I am ready.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Can you see me in the camera? Okay. We just published. We launched in November and in February, first in DC and then in Bogota, our book about measuring women's economic empowerment, lessons from South America, with a sponsorship from IDRC with FEDesarrollo. And thank you for inviting us to be here today. So it is really interesting what we just talked with Elena, because it really is really related to what we speak in the book, but we centered our evidence in South America. And next slide. And our motivation was, when we were in the field, we were doing the impact evaluation of a social protection program called Red Unidos, which aims at reducing extreme poverty in Colombia, and this program basically, we have a lot of social protection services by many ministries, and we were realizing, or the government was realizing, that a lot of the people in rural areas or victims of violence or the extreme poor were not having access to those services, even though they were available. And sometimes they were available in places not so close to them, because some live in remote areas. So basically, the program was aiming at matching that supply and demand with some social workers that would help families to get into these services with a preferential access. So we went to the field, we did, we gathered the data, and I really like to follow the field, and I'm very close to the field when I'm in Colombia. So I was helping with the interviews and listening to women. I listened to about 90 women during 2 weeks. And I realized many things that motivated me to write this book. So I realized that many of the instruments that we were using to measure women's economic empowerment were not working for the case of Colombia. And I'm gonna come and develop more about this later. I was also super excited to try new methods, subjective measures to measure agency, autonomy, freedom of choice. And I realized that we were not asking the right questions because we were having a lot of missing data, and the response of women were not really according to what the response should be. So we were not asking the right questions. And after a while, in several conferences, I started talking to my colleagues in Peru, in Uruguay, in Chile, and I told them, like, look, this is happening in my field. What is happening to you? And they told me, yeah, the same happens to me. And I was very surprised to hear this. And I said, well, we should write something, because what I feel that we are doing is that we are bringing instruments from other places where the literature of women's economic empowerment is very strong, like Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and we're bringing it to South America, and we are implementing, and it is not really working. And if you are not in the field, close to the field, like some of us are, you don't realize this problem. So this is the motivation of the book, and that's how we come together. So we have authors, two authors from Peru, and evidence from social protection programs in Peru, and Johanna Giancari and Martin Valdivia, and also Alma Espino from Uruguay, and Laura Ramos Jaimes from Colombia. Next slide. So summarizing a book in now 12 or 11 minutes is really difficult. So I just gonna focus on 5 ideas that I want people that are here with us, the one that they can take it when they are measuring or designing women's economic empowerment programs in South America. But the important thing is that local context matters. So this is not only relevant for South America, our evidence is from South America, but also for any context around the world. Next slide. So basically, we also have, we base our conceptual framework in Naila Kabir. And the first idea that I want to bring here is empowerment is a process. And it is really related to what Elena was saying. So for example, we need to consider that women need to have resources, like material, institutional resources, over which they can have access and control. And sometimes in social protection programs, in our regressions, we only measure access and not whether they can have control. This means, for example, it's not only enough that a rural woman has access to land, but that she can make decisions over that land, and that she has control over that land. Also agency, it entails negotiation, decision-making in the process of defining goals and acting upon them. And in the literature, something that we see very often, and in the demographic health surveys and everywhere, is that we consider a proxy for empowerment decision-making over household expenditures. And in our book, we suggest that in the case of Latin America, South America, this is not the case, because as Nancy Folber says, Latin American women are super moms, and women in South America have been traditionally in the major decision making in the household sphere. So we need to consider agency and decision making also outside the household, particularly in productive projects or in family businesses or in entrepreneurships, and see whether women are deciding are making strategic decisions to improve their lives in their business, and whether men are more involved in the household decision making. And then well-being achievements. We are very critical also in the book about the role of how we use often as economists, and I'm an economist, labor outcomes as a proxy of women's economic empowerment. So I'm going to come back to this. So basically, the first idea is empowerment is a process, and we need to consider resources, not only access but control, is agencies, but strategic decisions, and it is well-being. And well-being doesn't necessarily mean just have a job. This particularly in low-income backgrounds where the education of women is really low and the jobs that they can access are really difficult. So, and coming back to what Elena was saying, because it is a process, it needs to be measured in time, and some other things we do, and it is also because it's so expensive, is that we only do a baseline and a follow-up, and oh yeah, the program worked or didn't work, but we need to do more follow-ups over the time because it is a process. Next slide. So the second idea is that we must conceptualize women's economic empowerment according to a given context. So in our case, Latin American countries. This is a picture taken in Siloé in Cali. It's a favela, it's a poor area actually of my city, where we interviewed some women. Next slide. And why context matters? Because what we tend to do when we look at women's economic empowerment from a global perspective is that we assume that all decisions making are the same for all women. And it is not the case, and that's why local context matters. So for example, in Latin America, the household power has been traditionally, in terms of childhood decisions of children's education and uniforms and the groceries, has been traditionally in the hands of women. And also the amount of women head of households is higher than in other regions. So when we bring instruments to measure decision making, and we measure whether women are making decisions alone or with someone in the household about children's uniform and groceries, and we assume that that is empowering, we are making wrong design and wrong assumptions of what empowerment is for us. So for example, that is not necessarily a strategic decision, because it's actually taking away a lot of time from women that could be in the household, that could be used outside for economic and productive activities. So for example, I did a study with UNDP some years ago that said that in rural areas, low-income women in Colombia slept on average 3 to 4 hours less than men. So what we're measuring there in decision making as a proxy for empowerment is not really empowerment. It can be sleep deprivation, because women are sleeping too much. So when we design a program, we need to consider also that it's not only about women making decisions in the household that empowers them, because that is not a change. It's men making more decisions in the household and participating and sharing care activities with women, and women making more decisions, for example, in family businesses. And that is what Martin Valdivia brings in his impact evaluation of women in small and medium enterprises, which is one of the chapters of the book, where he shows that he shows how this program is trying to change not only that men can be more involved in the household activities, and that women are more involved in the productive activities of the company. And then we measure decision makings both at the household level and at the family business level. So that's what we would call here strategic decision making. Next slide. Yeah. like this is just an example of what the chapter of Martin does. So it's really interesting because when you see, for the people that know these, the traditional household decision making from the DHL demographic health survey just asks whether you make a decision over contraceptives and children's uniform and groceries, but they don't go into this level of depth. So for example, if you see in table 6, we are disaggregating different activities that can be done on a family business: investment in equipment, location remodeling, new products, loan applications, branding, picking providers, personal selection. And also in table 9, you can see activities in the household, but more disaggregated than what we see on average in all instruments. So washing and ironing, food preparation, house minor repairs, family care, care of sick members, and house cleaning. And what is interesting here of how we measure it is that it's not only what women do, but also what women perceive men do. And also what is interesting about this way of doing it is that normally we measure only decision making, but here we measure expresses an opinion, whether women express an opinion, which doesn't mean making a decision, whether the woman decides and acts, and I will divide that on a future research. Deciding is one thing, and acting upon the decision is another thing, or makes no decision at all. So that is what we have come regarding our context, where decision making is done in a different way. In Bangladesh, for example, in India, where the literature in decision making is so strong, it can be really strategic to make decision making over groceries, because traditionally the ones that make those decisions are the mothers-in-law, but it's not the case of South America. So we discuss this. Second idea, the role of local context matters for what type of decisions are really strategic and empowering for a woman. Next slide. Next slide. So the third idea that I want participants to have clear is the importance of integrating dimensions, subjective dimensions of women's economic empowerment, but that it requires to apply abstract concepts to real life scenarios. We need more pilots, extra serving training, new ways of asking, and using mixed methods. Next one. So what we identified in the impact evaluation of the social protection program, Red Unidos, can we go to the next one? What we identified is that people were not understanding, or we were not asking the right questions when it came to subjective measures. So for those that are not aware of these, we have been including a lot of psychological measures that psychologists have been measuring since the 50s and 60s, but in economics and in developing countries' economic empowerment measure, we are bringing these because of the role of agency. An agency is something really abstract to understand. It's controlling, having the freedom to choose, having autonomy, making decisions, making strategic decisions. This is all very abstract. So when we have higher levels of education, we understand these abstract concepts, but women in the field that we are interviewing with low levels of education do not understand necessarily abstract concepts of someone from a high education level. So we are not asking the right questions, and this is a really real big problem because we keep doing it over and over. And in 2 social protection programs evaluation in Peru and in Colombia, we did the same in the social protection evaluation of Red Unidos and in the pilot savings program of Juntos in Peru by Johanna Giancari, which there are 2 chapters about that in the book. And we realized that, I don't know if you are aware of this question, but it's really, really commonly used, which is the decision-making staircase. So we ask people whether they have, whether they feel that they have the freedom to choose over their lives or not. And then staircase number 10 is you have all the freedom to choose over your life. And staircase 1 is you don't have any freedom to choose over their life. And of course, normally you do examples and you show these to people so that they understand what it means. It is having all the choice, not having any choice, and this is a proxy for agency as in the process of economic empowerment. So in Colombia, we realized that people were not really understanding the question. They were responding things like that didn't even have to do with what we were asking. And in Peru, they told me that it took on average 8 minutes to respond this question, which for those that are aware with survey training and survey rules is too much. At that point, the person that is doing the survey is just forcing someone forcing someone into a response. So they decided not to use it, and we decided not to use it, and we include a chapter about that. So our conclusion here is we are not asking the right questions, and subjective measures, when we implement subjective measures to people with low education backgrounds, we need to really use concrete examples that relate to their lives. So it is not about having the freedom to choose, but it is, for example, when you have a problem with your cattle and you had to get them vaccinated, could you go and have them vaccinated? Yes, no. What were the elements that would allow you to make that decision of vaccinating your cattle? You know, like it has to be concrete examples that relate to their life. And that is also a problem that we are not really thinking a lot when we implement subjective measures, particularly with low-income, low-educated women. So third idea that I want people to bring is when you use subjective measures, they are really cool, they are really new, and but we need to land these to use concrete examples to ask those subjective questions. Next slide. Next slide. So yeah, for example, one example that we did in order to make it more concrete is this. So this was a democratic participatory activity. It is in Spanish because this is the real one that we did with them. And what we did was an activity, and we coded these and recorded it. So what is a woman that you admire? And then they had to put some post-its. Some people couldn't write, so we had to help them out. What is a woman that you don't admire? What are the things that you would like to have? And how would you achieve those things that you want to have? So in that way, we were doing several things. We were not imposing our positionality, meaning our view of what is important. Second, we were also seeing what was important for them. And third, we were taking them on a road so that they could tell us how to get there, and that is part of the agency process. Next slide. So the idea number 4 that I wanted all to take is measures of women's economic empowerment must consider subjective dimensions associated with labor decisions, the status of work, and the constraints that limit women's choices. For example, childcare, transportation and constraints. Well, it could be cost, or it could be access, or it could be distances of transportation, street and gang violence. Next slide. And this is very, very important because as economists, and we discuss this in the book a lot, we assume that certain social protection programs should improve women's labor opportunities, and having economic autonomy is really important for anybody, but we need to take into account whether those social protection programs are really solving some of the structural constraints that are important barriers for women to benefit from those programs. So for example, in my social protection evaluation, Red Unidos, what I found out is that although they were pulling millions of dollars into training and social protection and social workers and huge operation, they were not solving things that were key for women to take away women's barriers. So for example, childcare. Women didn't trust childcare services. They were very expensive when they were private. The public offer wasn't good enough. for them transportation. So women in the cities that live in the peripheries, in the suburbs, not suburbs in the sense of America, but poor suburbs, they take 2 hours to get to the places where they could have a formal job, and sometimes because of invisible frontiers, they would have to pay two transportations because gangs control territories, and then they will have to go around. It would take more time and more money. Gang violence is a huge problem, particularly for teenagers. So sometimes we assume that women, when they have children over 6 years old, it is easier for them to work, but it's not the case in Colombia. We found that it was from the day where they were born, maybe from the day they were 18, because gang violence take away a lot of teenagers' lives, and child rape by family members was also a huge concern. So a lot of women in the social protection program, they would link them with formal jobs, and they would not take them because they didn't trust childcare, because transportation was too expensive, or because their teenagers could be killed, or because of one of their children could be raped. So negotiating with their family members is also very important. And there's a chapter where we discuss how gender norms and the negotiation bargaining power that women have with their husbands is really important to make a decision. We find out that when women are negotiating getting a job in front of the husbands, they're less likely to take any job at all. So basically here, the conclusion of this part is structures matter. When we are designing social protection programs, we need to focus, of course, on a good design and the quality of the program, but also on the structural constraints that might affect women's decision to improve their well-being. And also how gender norms affect the kind of decisions that women can make to improve their well-being. And the last one, just to finish, next slide. Sorry, I forgot. So the last point about this idea is that the status of work matters, and it matters a lot. So in the case of Uruguay, this wasn't a social protection program, but it was a study made by Alma Espino. She found something really interesting. We assume that women's economic empowerment it means also having economic autonomy and working, and we all want that because no matter what, being economically independent is important. But what we found is that for low-income women with jobs that were not of high quality, working meant a sacrifice, and it didn't mean for them empowerment. While for high-income women, work was something positive and it meant empowerment. So when we are analyzing and including subjective measures to measure women's economic empowerment, the big idea here is, as I said, taking into consideration constraints that affect women's decisions, gender norms that affect women's decisions, and the quality of and status of work that changes according to the education level of women and the access to jobs they have locally. Next slide. And just to finish, the fifth idea that I want people to take is that we researchers must talk about our challenges in the field, share more, and be fully aware of how our positionality can bias the way we measure women's economic empowerment. And this is one of the central points of the book. We bring a lot of experiences from the field, from social protection programs, but a lot is also a reflection of how we need to tell other researchers and people in the field that are designing, implementing, what things work and what things don't work. There's a publication bias. It is hard to talk about our challenges, but for example, the evidence that we show about the fact that decision-making traditional questions from demographic health surveys are not relevant for South America. I think a lot of people know it. A lot of people were talking about it, but we were not sharing those experiences. So that we need to talk more, and we need to talk more particularly about what works, but also what doesn't work, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes in the field. And very, very important, a lot of researchers know about these, but we still do it is we need to understand how our positionality, the fact that I am a researcher from Colombia with a PhD and an expert in these areas, might bias the way I develop instruments. So for example, an example of this is subjective measures. Because of course I understand what is to have freedom to choose and have autonomy, I thought that that I could ask these kind of questions, and it is not only me, it is a lot of people from the best universities that are developing instruments with these kind of questions, but it is not necessarily how people would understand given their context and given the education background and given their needs. So this is a call, the fifth idea is a call to researchers or people that design, implement, evaluate policies to consider the challenges, to talk about them with others, and to consider the positionality. Next slide. And I invite everybody to download the book. It is available for free in the link there, or you can just Google it, or we can ask Social Protection to send it by email. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Just before we go to Tara, I just want to let you know that for some reason my internet connection is switching off, so I'm losing the contact. So if this happens after Tara has spoken, I would just like to ask Karina to take over the moderation in case you can't hear from me, and facilitate the question and answers section. I hope everything is going to be okay, but yeah, just in case, to let you know all. So Tara, please go ahead.
Great, thanks, Maya. I'm here today to talk about a qualitative, or specifically an ethnographic research perspective. I love qualitative research, and I'm really excited to be here, and also with Elena and Susanna. So in particular today, I'm going to talk about findings in a book that I'm publishing with University of California Press about the gendered impacts of CCTs. And that book will be available open access in May. And this project started with my PhD research at the University of Cambridge. And from there, I'm going to transition to sharing some ways that at Ladysmith, we incorporate feminist ethnographic methods in our practical policy research. Next slide. So I studied the Peruvian CCT program called Juntos, and I embarked on 11 months of ethnographic field work in the northern Andes Mountains, planning to understand the gendered impacts of the CCT through household surveys and interviews with mothers in the program. And this plan did not work out, and so I'll explain a little bit about what happened. Next slide, please. So because I was not affiliated with the Juntos program, I needed to connect with CCT recipients. So the regional Juntos office in northern Peru allowed me to accompany a local manager to a Juntos meeting so that I could do this. And at this meeting, I observed the local manager tell mothers to participate in a whole bunch of activities that weren't part of the Juntos program. For instance, one of these was to march in the district governor's forthcoming carnival parade. And the women at the meeting protested this. They said that there would be alcohol there and they didn't like that, and who would take care of their children and other dependents who they'd have to leave at home. But the local manager didn't present this parade as an option. And I saw lots of this dynamic, not only with this local manager in this district, but with other local managers in other districts. And this frequently involved threatening women with expulsion from the program if they didn't do as told. Next slide. So two things happened after this meeting. First, I decided to make contact with Juntos mothers through an alternative route, externally to the Juntos program. And this is because when cash transfer recipients are afraid that they might lose the transfer, which is really an important injection of resources into the household, They're unlikely to speak frankly with someone that they think is associated with the CCT. So I wanted to establish trust as a researcher external to Juntos. And I did this through local women's organizations that worked in communities where Juntos was implemented. And second, I wanted to know why local managers were getting women to do all of these extra things in the name of the Juntos program. And it was obvious that the research methodology that I had planned, household surveys and interviews with beneficiary mothers, wasn't going to be enough. Next slide. So I pivoted to using a different research methodology called institutional ethnography, developed by a feminist sociologist called Dorothy Smith. And the goal of this approach is to understand how institutional implementation and decision-making processes shape the experiences of the people who use social programs and other services like healthcare, education, transportation. And in particular, institutional ethnography pays attention to women's time and unpaid labor in households and communities. Next slide. So what did institutional ethnography look like in the context of Juntos? First, it meant identifying issues that women faced in their everyday lives as they attempted to meet Juntos' conditions and to care for themselves and for their families. And second, it meant understanding implementation practices. So this involved observing and interviewing CCT staff, and also observing and interviewing staff in the health clinics, the schools, and the banks where Juntos mothers met the conditions. And what I learned from this local level of implementation, I then traced higher into the institution, interviewing and observing board members, bureaucrats, and policymakers at Juntos headquarters and at the Ministry for Development and Social Inclusion, where Juntos is housed. Next slide, please. So this methodology allowed me to identify a number of gendered, unintended outcomes that are rarely discussed in the literature about CCTs, and also to locate their drivers. And today I'll discuss two of these. Next slide, please. So the first finding is that Juntos mothers in rural Peru do a great deal of walking and waiting for poor quality services. So for instance, women frequently walk to the health clinic to meet the program conditions with their children, only to find it closed. And in order to have their compliance with the health conditions registered, the mothers had to walk back again and again until they found it open for service. And this walking and waiting is not captured in routine program evaluations that come with a predefined narrow set of metrics that don't include service quality or women's time use or their access to transportation. And because of these exclusions, contribute to the view that CCTs are efficient. Next slide, please. And so the second and most striking finding was that local managers and other authorities, including teachers, health staff, local government, and other workers from unaffiliated NGOs, use their power and threats of program suspension to get mothers to participate in what I call shadow conditions. And these are activities that extend beyond the policy. They're not officially sanctioned. And the carnival parade that I mentioned earlier is one example, but let me give you a few others. In my observations and interviews, I found that women believed that they were to grow a garden, give birth in a health clinic, keep their hygiene instruments like toothbrush and soap organized, keep a tidy house, cook unpaid for the school lunch program, maintain a latrine, use the state daycare, participate in the district governor's re-election parade, paint the Juntos flag on the outside of their house, contribute to the medical costs of a neighbor's broken leg, use a smokeless stove, attend hygiene trainings, participate in a regional cooking fair, attend literacy workshops, and, quote, do whatever the local manager tells me to. So in all of the interviews that I conducted, women named at least 2 of these, and typically they named 4 or 5. So here's an area where an institutional approach to the research really excelled. So first, by observing program implementation, I was able to understand that local managers sometimes enforce these shadow conditions because they felt it was in women or children's best interest. This is what was necessary to overcome poverty or build human capital. And other times, it was because the local managers needed the help of health staff or the local governor or some other NGO worker in getting their work done. Because also in rural Peru, for the local managers to access these services was like healthcare or education in order to monitor the conditions was also challenging. So the second reason where an institutional approach really excelled relates to what Elena said earlier about gender featuring in program goals. So by interviewing policymakers about implementation, I learned that they were well aware of poor quality services, women's wasted time, and local abuses of power. But they didn't have to respond to these issues because in the broader policy environment, women's experiences weren't part of the metrics used to measure whether or not the CCT was successful, efficient, or effective. Next slide, please. So I talked about some of the findings from slow, academic, 11 months of ethnographic research. But through my company, Ladysmith, we also do a lot of policy research. And I realized that not everyone can do a year-long ethnography when they're wanting to evaluate a social protection program. So when the Ladysmith team is doing more rapid, pragmatic evaluations, we use what we call our feminist gender data toolkit. And I'll share with you the key themes of this. Next slide, please. So the first is, when you don't have time to do slow research, make use of existing slow research. So my book is just one example, but there are decades of feminist research that highlights issues related to social policy, including women's time use, experiences of violence, and transformative definitions of empowerment. And Susanna's work is an example of this. And practical evaluations would do really well to take that research seriously. Next slide, please. And the second theme in Ladysmith's Feminist Data Toolkit is to involve women in the research process. So everywhere in the world, there are local women's movements, and we should be asking them, what do you think about these programs? What do your members think about these programs? And I explained earlier that this was a really important way that I learned about the findings I present in my own field study in Peru. And we also make use of local women's movements, consult with local women's movements in our rapid policy research at Ladysmith. Next slide, please. And the third theme is think intersectionally, and this is related to the last two. So the negative and unintended impacts of juntos that I've discussed don't only have to do with gender inequality, they also have to do with the fact that juntos mothers experience ethnic discrimination from local authorities. They live in a rural geography with a history of underinvestment in basic services. And women's movements and good feminist scholarship tend to deal with these intersecting drivers of inequality, including social class, race, ethnicity, age, and geographical location. Next slide, please. So, and finally, 2 points about mixed methods research. The first is that there's no substitute for fieldwork. qualitative research isn't an alternative to quantitative evaluations. In fact, it's a really good way to be able to critically evaluate the quality of statistics and also to show where quantitative research could look to identify other important trends. And getting out where people live, understanding how they access services is really important. Next slide, please. And the second point about mixed methods is that ethnographic fieldwork is also a really good way to document institutional practices and processes, including the ones that go off the books. So understanding and mapping out how policies actually get implemented, how people go about their work on a regular basis, is one of the main ways that qualitative research can highlight gaps in quantitative evaluation and feed into program iteration, feed into the redesign of programs. Next slide, please. So to conclude, we can probably all agree that improving women's experiences of participating in social protection programs is really important, especially because their participation tends to be what drives them. And this requires understanding the kind of broader conditions of women's lives. Slow ethnographic research is one of the best ways to do this, but when time or resources aren't available, there are other principles of feminist research that can be applied. And so to review, these include making use of existing slow research, involving women in the monitoring and evaluation process, thinking intersectionally, and doing field work that includes documenting how social programs get implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. We have received some interesting questions, so I'll be very quick actually and ask 3 questions for each of the presenters, just in case my internet connection switches off. So the first question is for Elena. Have any, in your research that you have done, have any of the impact evaluations tried to explore which and how specific program design features have actually influenced the type and the scale of the gender outcomes? So that's the first question for Elena. The second question is for Susanna. People have been very excited about your idea to share more about what works and what doesn't work in the research on women's economic empowerment. So people are asking if there is a platform that you are aware of or a network that it's already set up where people can actually, the researchers can discuss their experiences and the challenges they face more regularly, and whether you can share some of the examples so they can join those networks. And then the third question is for Tara. How did the government policymakers or the program staff respond to your study and the results? I mean, which were not necessarily, let's say, positive. Were they receptive, or did you encounter some of the sort of resistance to these findings? So I will switch off now and ask Elena to respond to the first question. Thank you.
Yes, in terms of the results on domestic violence, there haven't been a lot of studies on that. But the ones that do look at the impact on domestic violence, in trying to assign an explanation of what happens, look at heterogeneous impact. So first of all, I think we had about 3-4 studies on this, and the distinction was made between physical violence and emotional violence. Not all the time both are changing. We found encouraging results. All these 3 studies found encouraging results. One for Juntos found that both the type of violence were decreasing for women that were receiving the money. but this impact was larger for women that were in paid employment, and was not as large for women that had been abused as children. So this is a study that Elisabetta Perova did, and was published in 2010. In other studies, look at the education of the woman and look at heterogeneous impact along this line, or also the differences between the education of the woman and the education of the man. So, for example, there is a finding in Ecuador for the Bono de Desarrollo Humano, where the impact is where there is essentially an impact on emotional violence, a decrease in emotional violence that is larger for more educated women. But this is especially true if the women have less education than their partner. So there is an assumption, that's my reading of these impact evaluations, that essentially the man could have a potential appreciation for the woman bringing in money, as long as this doesn't threat perhaps a position or a ranking in the household. But this is speculation, in the sense that an impact evaluation has limitations in terms of how well they can explore this type of findings. They typically do it through disaggregating the impacts for different groups of women.
So to respond my question, that's a very interesting idea, to create a platform to share our challenges and misfortunes. To the best of my knowledge, we don't know it. I think I do therapy when I go to conferences and I speak to other researchers about what has happened. But there's an interesting model that is called fuck up stories about failure. I don't know. It's very common in the entrepreneurial world. So basically, people that have co-founded or founded startups and that have failed meet and tell their failure stories, and it is just about failure stories. So, but it's not depressing, it is funny, and it is to help people that are starting other ventures, to help them don't make the same mistakes. So maybe I leave with this idea and start thinking how we could do some sort of virtual community where we share what works, what doesn't work, and how we can solve what doesn't work, because it is also about improving.
All right, and I'll answer the question about how the government in Peru responded to my study. And first, I'll just say that there actually were positive findings as well, as is the case with cash transfers in all countries. The injection of cash into the household really does make a very important, really important change in how households are able to manage meeting their everyday basic needs, and that includes for women. In relation to the sort of negative elements, the walking and waiting, poor quality services, and the shadow conditions, like I mentioned, the government was very well aware of what was going on, and they were really frustrated. But there was very little that they could do. I mean, state governments also operate within resource constraints. They have a limited amount of money, whether it's external or internal funding. And so it's actually not just up to the state governments to implement the programs. It's also up to the funders of CCT programs and the broader international development community to change the actual indicators for how we measure what a successful development intervention looks like. And this is actually very similar to what Elena said earlier. When indicators around women's well-being or gender equality aren't built into program goals, there's no incentive to measure them. So it extends kind of beyond the state, is basically how I'd answer that. So it's not just about sort of pointing a finger or laying blame.
Tara, have you finished with your response?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, because of this connection, I'm not sure. Okay, the second round of questions, I will return back to Elena, the question that I asked before, which was, have any of the impact evaluations tried to explore how specific program design features, you mentioned quotas and you mentioned functional or instrumental targeting of women, how these design features have influenced the actual type of gender outcomes and the scale of outcomes? Do impact evaluations measure that, or they sort of ignore that aspect of the assessment?
You mean in terms of like, so if the question is how the different tools are used to target women might produce different outcomes, this is it's a very hard question to answer, because obviously, you can use a quota in public works programs, and by the way, quotas are increasingly used, are generally set at very arbitrary level. But this is not the only tool. There are other tools that can be used, like, for example, making public works, making the conditions of work more favorable for women, like work sites that are closer to where the women live, having facilities at the workplace and so on and so forth. And it seems like this type of intervention might be even more promising than quotas. But there is not really an assessment in this case where we keep a constant type of program, public works. First, there is not even an assessment of whether the quotas are really helpful in increasing participation. And also if these are more effective, even less, if they are more effective than other type of ways of integrating women in the project. So it's so specific that I really don't think we can say something about it.
Thanks, thank you. There is a question for Tara. I think it's for Tara because it's about intersectionality. And if you can elaborate a little bit more on that point, how intersectionality has both sort of affected the outcomes, but also how you integrated this issue of intersectionality in your research, the analytical framework as well as the methodologies you used.
Absolutely. Intersectionality is a concept that's taken from feminist research and is often quite sort of overwhelming when we go to apply it practically. But it is really, really important. So often when we are thinking about measuring gender outcomes, the way that gender gets used is often equated with biological sex. And that's not the way that feminist researchers would want that term to be used. So when we think about gender, we need to think about relationships of power, how men and women relate to one another, and the social norms, like how do you act like a woman or a mother? How do you act like a man? And then when we're thinking intersectionally more broadly, thinking about age, sexuality, social class, you have to think about how all of those things sort of come together and how one can change the other. So for practically speaking, for the study in Peru, this meant thinking, okay, Juntos is a rurally implemented program. It's implemented in communities as well that are majority indigenous. So how does ethnic discrimination and ethnic discrimination against women and women of a particular age, mothers, how does that all come together? So how, for instance, is a woman's experience of meeting conditions in health shaped by her age, where she lives, her geographical location, her social class, the amount of money that she has access to, and her ethnicity. Does she have to walk 3 hours? So measuring time use is one way that we can practically do that. What do her interactions at the health clinic look like when health staff are typically middle class, well-educated, and urban people, and often whiter? How does that sort of interaction between those two actors play out? And so it's just sort of thinking through at a practical level, service usage, relationships between the different people who come together to implement a CCT program, time use and access, which is something, access to transportation, which is also something that Susanna mentioned. So I hope that answers your question. I'd be happy to follow up offline on that a little bit more as well.
And just a comment on that, it's very important when you're evaluating that not all intersectionalities apply to every single context, because then you start disaggregating the 10 things, but to understand what matters for that specific problem. So for example, since I work a lot in labor markets, age, social class, ethnicity, and age are crucial. And age is something that sometimes we forget. We're like, yeah, social class and ethnicity, of course, being Afro-Colombian or indigenous or low-income Afro-Colombian is all the same, and that's pretty much understood. But when it comes to work, being 50 is not the same as being 20. And that's something that we always forget, to understand the context and what matters for that context. And I understand this also as the sum of vulnerabilities. So being a woman makes us more vulnerable. Being a woman from a minority, excluded minority, makes us twice as vulnerable. And being a woman from an excluded minority that is 55 makes us 3 times as vulnerable as other women. So thinking about vulnerability in a given context really helps to understand what matters. I think we can keep, I think that Maya was having problems with her connection. Maybe we can keep discussing and asking questions.
Oh, sorry about this. Yes, I keep losing the connection. Would you like to elaborate more, or would you like me to ask a last set of questions? Okay, if I'm switched off, I'm apologizing. We have a question for Elena. What is the place and role of culture in women's empowerment, and how can you appreciate this fact in the impact evaluations? That's the question for Elena. The second one is for Susanna. If you can tell us something about how you can improve women's involvement in strategic decision making. I mean, this is not necessarily related to impact evaluations, but you mentioned strategic dimensions of women's status. So if you can maybe give some tips on how you can improve their involvement in strategic decision making, I'm assuming at the household level. Okay. And then we have a question for Tara. Again, it's sort of along the lines of context. So do you think that some of your findings can be contextualized into a given working environment? I'm assuming that the working environment is referring to the programs and the operations of the program and I guess the policy setup. So this is the last round of questions, and all the other questions we will post on our socialprotection.org in our group in the community, and you can find the responses to the questions at a later stage, where we will also be posting the recordings of this webinar. I'm saying this now just in case I lose the connection. Okay, please, Elena, go forward.
Elena. Sorry for interrupting you, but I think your mic is off. Can you turn it on, please?
Sorry, yes, something got wrong. No, I was just saying that it's an interesting question asked to a World Bank person, this question about the culture, because there is both the culture, what I think the person that asked the question meant, I mean, how do we take into account the local culture, but there is also our own organizational culture of a big institution that is producing a lot of interventions and is actually has to try, especially in these cases, to really go at the local level and be able to appreciate all these differences and the fact that an intervention doesn't really look the same in different places and is really shaped by the local culture. So now, a big institution like the World Bank uses both hard and soft ways of creating incentives to do so. So definitely we have to combine, what are standardized indicators that we often use to try to measure the results with incentives that actually go and are able to really shape the intervention at the local level. One thing that happened, for example, in the CCT, I give a very practical example, was that all the lessons that were coming from Latin America, when the bank started doing CCT in Africa, it was quite obvious that they could not be implemented in the same way. And an interesting set of impact evaluations in that case, and also studies that surrounded the preparation of the project, pointed to the fact that probably we should not be giving the money to the woman, but to the father, for example, if this is where, if it is the father that buys food for the household, or what do we do in polygamous households? So there are all these questions that are obviously trying to, that challenge the notion that the program has to be the same everywhere. And I think that in this case, through impact evaluation, through trying, to adapt this program to the local context, and there are some also description in the report, there was an attempt to do that. That said, of course, the type of research that Tara was describing, or even Susanna, it's requires time. It's not probably appropriate for, it's hard for the World Bank to really, use this level of depth in assessing the intervention, the local culture, and shaping the intervention accordingly.
So my question was about how to improve women's involvement in strategic decision making at the household, or I think also at productive activities, because the problem that we have is that we are too empowering the household and then we don't have time to do anything else. So I think that one of the problems that we have when we want to measure and create policies is to think that there's a recipe, and as Elena and Tara were saying, there's not a recipe, so it's hard for me to say what the thing that we have to do to improve this is really hard to say because it depends on the context, it depends on the program. But I can give an example of how you can design in order to improve this. So, for example, coming back to the chapter in the book written by Martin, this was a program designed, women small and medium enterprises, designed to help women with their businesses, home businesses. These are very small, sometimes informal businesses, but the program was giving training. And okay, so how can you improve this strategic decision making? So first we need to understand conceptually what really strategic means. So strategic in the sense of Naila Kabir is a decision that is going to allow me to change my life on a positive way and to improve my well-being. So if the decision, for example, is to buy more groceries, and that is taking away time from productive activities, maybe that's not a strategic decision making. Then strategic decision making is, for example, making decisions over the family business. So how can a training program or a social protection program improve that? So you need to have a quality training program where women really learn, but something that we can do also is involve men in the process, because there's a lot of evidence, and I think it was Selena that was saying that this as well. There's a lot of evidence where domestic violence has increased as a result of social protection programs or economic empowerment programs that allow women to earn more money. So if we have some new masculinities workshops and involvement in the process and make them understand the importance of having women contributing to the household, that if they lose the power they're not going to lose the power, it's a family, it's a team, and then you introduce this into the program, maybe women are going to be more involved in strategic decisions in the family business. And by strategic decisions, I mean also how to expand the business and how to invest or how to go to new markets. Because what happens also in family businesses where both husband and wife work is that women tend to do more the housekeeping stuff. So like paying people or checking the bills are okay, and then make the strategic decision making in the business. So one response will be by including men in the programs, and it is not, when including men, I don't say that they benefit from the program, but that they are aware of the process and the importance of women's economic empowerment. We can allow women to make these strategic decisions that would benefit them and will benefit the household. That's an example. But again, we cannot have a formula. This is case by case, and local context matters on how we design this. I'm giving this example for South America, but this is really probably not the case of how things should be done in other regions.
All right, and I'll answer, my question was if these findings are sort of contextually dependent, or if this was some way that the policy was set up particular to Peru. Well, I'll go sort of by each of the two findings that I presented. First of all, with what I call shadow conditions, these extra activities were first sort of found and presented in the program evaluations in Mexico over 10 years ago. They've also been found in Colombia and in Uruguay. And what I've done that's a little bit different is sort of go further and think about why did these happen, and how in implementation do these arise. And the second, walking and waiting for poor quality services, a Colombian researcher named Maria Elisa Valen did a really interesting study, and she talks about women queuing in the sun. So the women who then go to wait for these services that are of poor quality. In terms of incentives, we could really think about in any place that a cash transfer is conditional, that there very well could be a power imbalance between the people who implement the programs or provide the services and the women who receive the programs. And unconditional cash transfers, of course, could eliminate or reduce this sort of coercive element that comes up. And in terms of the sort of walking and waiting for services that are of poor quality, Brazilian economist Lena Lavinas has written about how conditional cash transfers really effectively increase the demand for services, but if there isn't an adequate investment in improving the quality of those services, you're going to have health clinics and schools that are not meeting the demand of the population. And so finally, another thing that I'd like to say is that we actually really can find out about these things. We can find out about unintended gendered consequences without doing an 11-month ethnography. And I've outlined a few of these ways that we do this at Ladysmith. Susanna outlined a few of these ways that she does it as well with core women. And I think that it's important because gender equality and a world that's better for women to live in actually really depends on it.
Thank you very much. We slightly went over time. So I would like to thank the panelists for wonderful discussions and presentations. I would like to thank everybody for joining us and asking good questions. So we will respond to more of the questions online, where, as I said, in the platform, in the socialprotection.org platform, we have an online community that is dedicated to gender-sensitive social protection. So all the materials of the webinars will be posted there. We'll look forward to meeting you at our next webinar, which is going to be on gender social protection in humanitarian emergency context, a very sort of hot topic at the moment. And also, I would like to thank our colleagues at the IPC Center for doing another wonderful work in facilitating and organizing this webinar. Thank you so much, and yeah, hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Maya.
Thank you.